So we have with us today Ruben Tarne from the University of Groningen, and who will be presenting his work on inequality, a study of inequality. He's been doing a great deal of work studying inequality and the interaction with macroprudential policy on a housing agent-based model, which is the work he's going to present today. If you have questions, please just interrupt the speaker as you go. And otherwise, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for it. Ruben, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, for the kind introduction. Yes, this is I'm a PhD student at the University of Groningen, and this paper I'm writing with Dirk Bezemer and Thomas Theobald, and it's called "The Effect of Macroprudential Policy on Debt, Wealth Inequality and Consumption: An Agent-Based Analysis." And the central motivation to look at this is the fact that it has been recognized that strongly rising household debt can be destabilizing to the financial system and the economy. And we see here from the IMF 2012 report, I think, that high debt or like banking crises and recessions that have been accompanied by a run-up of fast rising household debt usually experience longer or like worse consumption, lower consumption by households. So there seems to be a connection between debt and consumption. And macroprudential policy is usually introduced with the aim to reduce financial risk. Macroprudential policies are policies like loan-to-value ratios, maximum loan-to-value ratios for households that want to buy a home, or debt-to-income ratios. And so far, the empirical literature has mainly focused on the effect of macroprudential policy on house prices and mortgage debt. But there has also been, in the last couple of years, especially a broadening to include potential side effects of macroprudential policy, like wealth inequality and aggregate demand. And this makes intuitive sense because if you restrict households or like you interfere in their asset accumulation, this can potentially have effects on wealth inequality. And if you affect house prices and you assume that there's some sort of wealth or collateral or precautionary savings effect, you would expect some effect on consumption as well. The one major limitation or problem for the empirical literature is that the data is limited because most of the macroprudential policies have only been introduced after the great financial crisis. And if you like go into more detail, and there has been like the recommendation by the IMF, the Financial Stability Board, and the Bank for International Settlements to increase the policy efficiency by restricting different types of debtors differently. For instance, set different loan-to-value ratios for first-time buyers, second or subsequent buyers, or buy-to-let investors. But if you want to look at the effects of these policies, you have even fewer data because only a couple of central banks are applying these borrower type-specific rules. And if you want to model them, your model complexity needs to deal, or like your model needs to deal with a lot of heterogeneity, and then the complexity increases considerably, which brings us to agent-based modeling quite naturally, which can deal with this quite well. And so what we do in our paper is to analyze these borrower-specific loan-to-value caps, their effect on household debt, wealth inequality, and consumption volatility in an agent-based housing market model. And we look on consumption volatility because the model we are using is a partial market model, so we don't have a feedback loop of consumption to income, which could have like long-term effects on consumption. So we focus more on the volatility aspect. And our research question is, if there's is there an efficient way to implement loan-to-value caps? That means are we able to achieve a substantial reduction of household debt and consumption volatility without negative so-called side effects, meaning avoiding to increase wealth inequality significantly, for instance. And I want to foreshadow our main findings later after this slide. And first, talk a bit about my method, or our method. And it's basically a modification of the INET housing market model as it's published in Baptista et al. 2016. And they calibrated it to the UK with microdata sources, including the Wealth and Asset Survey and the housing market data from Zoopla. What we change are two things. The first one is that we change the consumption function of households by implementing a wealth-dependent and income-dependent marginal propensity to consume. Because in the original model, the consumption function serves mainly the purpose of keeping the distribution of financial wealth, and in the model, these are just deposits, keeping these distributions close to real data. And this means that every household has kind of a target, like a deposit target, that it, so if the household's deposits are over this target, then it consumes, and if it is below, then it saves. And this leads to a consumption pattern where in the housing market upswing, when there are a lot of sales and a lot of housing transactions, that households that just sold their home to, for instance, move to another home, that they consume very intensely for a brief period of time. And you get like a consumption cycle that is quite kind of flat. And then in the upswing, you have this high uptick, and then it goes down and it's flat again. And this is not what we see in real data. And like with the change of the consumption function, we can see that housing and consumption, as house prices and consumption cycles move together. And this then allows us to study consumption volatility. The other change that we implemented is to make the commercial banks' credit constraints procyclical, but I will go into detail there later on. First, I want to foreshadow the main findings, and these are that restricting loan-to-value caps for buy-to-let investors yields the most favorable results. So we see the strongest effect on debt levels. We see a reduction in wealth inequality and the strongest reduction in consumption volatility. If we restrict first-time buyers, this actually increases wealth inequality. And we find that restricting second and subsequent buyers has only limited effects. Okay, let's give you a brief overview of the model, and then we can talk about these. Then we can talk about the results and the dynamics of the model. So, as I already mentioned, we use the agent-based model by Baptista et al. This is, as I have already also mentioned, a partial model of the UK housing market. So we have no feedback loop from consumption to income. It is non-spatial, but houses have a quality parameter, which serves as a proxy for house location, size, and condition. And the households in the model can, that are like active on the housing and the renting market, are social houses, renters, owner-occupiers, and buy-to-let investors. And as is common with agent-based models, these households all differ along certain characteristics, their age, income, and financial wealth. And then based on these characteristics, the agents or the households decide what submarket they want to enter. Do they want to buy a home? Do they want to sell a house? Do they want to enter the rental market? And so on. And then they place bids on these markets or offers. And then depending on the behavior of other agents, houses are bought, sold, and rented via a double auction process. Apart from households, the model also considers institutional factors. So there's a commercial bank that is lending out mortgage credits, mortgages. And households are subject to their lending conditions, and there is a central bank setting like loan-to-value caps. Okay. Let me introduce to you the kind of the bids and offers side of the markets, and how these different types of agents change their status or their state. So we start here when a household is born, they go into social housing. And this is kind of the starting pool position for all households. And here they decide if they want to place a bid on the housing market, on the ownership market. And if they decide to do so, they bid. And if they don't bid on this market, they bid on the rental market. So how do they do that? Basically, households in social housing ask, do I want to rent or do I want to buy? And they make this decision by comparing costs. So what is more expensive? This they don't do, so they look for the cheapest option. And basically this long equation compares costs of renting or buying a house of the same quality. There's also a parameter for the house, like for expected house price appreciation or depreciation. So if the if households expect prices to rise, they are willing to pay more for buying a home than if they're not going to rise. And this expectation mechanism is quite simple. It's just backward-looking expectations. So if house prices have been rising in the past, then households expect house prices to rise in the future, a bit more conservative than the past trend. But this is the same for all households. So this is very simple. Then the second question that they ask themselves, if they want to buy a home, if they want to buy a house, how much credit is the bank going to give me, and how much do I actually want to spend on buying a home? And these are these two terms. So the main influence, or the main influence for the desired house price that they want to bid for is this alpha, and this is basically a factor of, I think in our model it's 4.5, so 4.5 times their yearly income. And this term is the credit that the bank is willing to give the household. And the lowest of these prices is then the bid price that they enter the market with. If, for instance, the bank doesn't, I don't know, gives you a very, very low loan, and you are not able to even buy the lowest quality house, then you don't enter the market at all. So this is kind of how credit rationing works here. But also if house prices are so high that even with the 4.5 times of your income, you're not able to bid for the lowest quality home, then you also don't enter the market. Okay, so this is kind of the way how social houses become owner-occupiers. And then we have like a subset of households that can become buy-to-let investors. And we set this share exogenously to 8% of households, which are in the upper half of the income distribution, are allowed or are able to bid for more property than just their home. So they can buy investment property and then rent this out to renters on the private renting market. And their decision behavioral rules or decision rules are different. In our model version, they first ask themselves, do I have enough high enough income buffer? So if I already spend more than 50% of my net income, then I will not go in for more, and this way we reduce bankruptcies in the model. And if this condition does not hold, then they basically calculate the prospective yield on their equity. And there are two types of buy-to-let agents that calculate this yield differently. There are trend followers and fundamentalists. And fundamentalists put more weight on the expected rental yield, and trend followers put more weight on the expected price appreciation or depreciation. So they are entering the market when prices are increasing, and the other agents are also entering the market when rental yield is high. The bid price of these households is just limited by what the bank is willing to give them. So they want to leverage up as much as possible. Okay, so this was the bid side of the market. Let's look at the offer side. First, owner-occupiers in the UK move on average every 17 years. And since we don't simulate the reasons for why households would move, we just this is just set to on average every 17 years a household puts their home on the market. For buy-to-let investors, for buy-to-let investors this is a bit different. They basically calculate for each house they have each month the expected yield in the future. So if they see that the yield of their property turns negative, the probability of selling this house increases. And there is kind of a rule that they always keep one property but can sell all the others. Okay. Coming to the change that we did to the consumption function. I already mentioned why we had felt that we need to change the consumption function, and this is what we came up with. It's basically a very simple consumption function where you have some minimum consumption, then some consumption out of disposable income, and alpha here is the marginal propensity to consume, and it's dependent on their income level. So the lower the income, the higher the marginal propensity to consume. And we have like a wealth factor, so wealth induces consumption as well. Beta is the marginal propensity to consume induced by wealth, and it's also dependent on the income level of households. So the higher the income of a household, the lower the marginal propensity to consume is here. B are the deposits, so financial wealth. So the effect is strongest here. And then we have gamma, that is a dampening factor for net housing wealth. So since for the UK, it seems, or the empirical data suggests that consumption out of net housing wealth is lower than consumption out of financial wealth. So this builds desired consumption, and then this is subject to some constraints. This first bit complicated equation just says that there is a precautionary saving motive. So households want to keep twice their disposable income as deposits as a safety threshold. And if consumption would reduce this threshold below this value, then the wealth effect is deactivated. And since alpha is never above 1, it's always below, for the lowest income households, I think it's 99 or 98%. So then they save minimally, but they will not dissave. Then there are cases where the desired consumption is lower than their minimum consumption. This could be if income is lower than expenditures, and or if they experience like large amounts of negative equity. For instance, if they're highly leveraged and house prices are low, they like from this calculation, they might end up with a consumption that is lower than C0, and then in this case they will consume C0, and in all other cases they consume their desired consumption. Yeah, just to show you like where is the model able to match the reality, you could say. We compared with the Bank of England housing market core indicators for the UK. This is also what Baptista et al. Did in their paper. And you see here, these are the model values, and this is like the pre-crisis range of values, and this is like the last year value. Where it's green, it's in the range of observed values, and where it's yellow, it's either below or above. So, for instance, household mortgage debt to income overall is well in line with what we observe in the UK. But for instance, the owner-occupier loan-to-income ratio is a bit lower. Yeah, but the buy-to-let mortgage loan-to-value ratio is in the range. There's some here that we, in this model, there are more transactions or more advances to buy-to-let purchases than we see in the UK. This we should keep in mind when thinking about the results. Okay, already 20 minutes in. Just briefly, the model dynamics. This is what you see here is a housing cycle and the debt to income ratio divided up into the contributors to the debt to income ratio. So who is holding the debt? Red is buy-to-let investors, blue is second and subsequent buyers, and green is first-time buyers. And you see that the largest bulk of debt is held by movers or second and subsequent buyers. And the most dynamic impact is done by buy-to-let investors, where debt to income explodes in the upswing and then tapers off in the downturn. And we see that first-time buyers overall don't hold a lot of debt in this model. The wealth inequality here measured as top 10%, like the wealth share of the top 10%. It moves countercyclically, as you would expect from the empirical data, because like if housing wealth is more equally distributed than financial wealth, so when house prices rise stronger than financial asset prices, you see a decrease in wealth inequality. And this is what we can see here as well. And finally, our third indicator is consumption. The consumption dynamics here, we break them down into like the components of our equation. Blue is consumption induced by income. Yellow is consumption induced by financial wealth. And green is consumption induced by net housing wealth. And we see that it moves quite procyclically with the housing cycle. Okay, so what I've shown you until now are is kind of our traditional banking model, which we will change now. So this is, sorry, too fast. Here you see the two housing cycles of our model, and the orange line is the commercial bank's maximum loan-to-value ratio. We call this traditional banking because this is the boring. You have to put 20% down payment before you buy a home or a house or a property. For all agents, it doesn't change with the cycle, that's it. But this doesn't seem to be very realistic. We've seen in the run-up to the Great Financial Crisis procyclical lending constraints by commercial banks, and also like when prices plummeted, the lending constraints got much stricter. And sorry, I'm a bit confused with my mouse wheel. So we implemented a very simple procyclical loan-to-value rule for the commercial bank. So we have like a basis value. This is 80%. Because we've seen like loan-to-value ratios fluctuating more or less around 80%. And this here is a term where you have the price expectation that is the same as for households, as I introduced before, and a dampening factor of alpha. And so I'm curious to see if this works now. Yeah, sorry. So what we see here is the result of this modification. The orange line is the commercial banks a maximum loan-to-value ratio that it offers households. And we see, like, in the housing market upswing, it goes up to 100%. There it is capped because above 100% doesn't make sense in our model. And as soon as prices stabilize, this line goes back to 80%. And then we see when prices fall, it goes even below and goes to around 55, 60% and picks up again. You can also see, like, on the right-hand side is the house price index. It is the price cycles explode in this extreme version, where it's going up to 100%, the loan-to-value ratio. But this is kind of our pre-crisis model, and now we introduce the macroprudential policies to then introduce the borrower-specific macroprudential policies. So, Jesus Christ, I messed this up a bit. So what you see here is the introduction of an anti-cyclical macroprudential policy rule of with a loan-to-value cap of 90%. So when there's an upswing, then this rule bites, and the commercial bank's purple line is capped at 90%. And when prices start to fall, the rule is deactivated, so it's at 100%. But we also see that this doesn't really make a difference if it's anti-cyclical or just a stable rule, because the commercial bank is more prudent, like in our model version at least. It is way more conservative than what the central bank is kind of allowing the bank to do. Okay, so let's go to the results. First, the results for these three model versions, and then to the results for our agents borrower-specific limitations. So we just have here the three target variables. We see that the average debt-to-income ratio for our traditional banking regime is at 98 or 89%. Sorry. The wealth inequality is on average at almost 50%, and we have a maximum in these runs of 67.3%. We measure the consumption volatility as the amplitude because we have bimodal consumption distributions. And we, because as you could have seen, like the cycles are, you have like longer phases of low prices where consumption is low, and then you have longer phases of high prices where consumption is high, so you get like a bimodal distribution. And changes in the amplitude that I will present further, these are mainly changes in the maximum consumption, because by macroprudential policy it affects only the peaks of the housing cycles and not the trough phases. They're pretty similar for all the model versions because macroprudential rules don't bite there. So we see for these three target indicators that they get worse, quite worse with our quite extreme procyclical credit version. The maximum debt-to-income ratio we record more than doubles. The average is at 167%. Wealth inequality increases also, and consumption volatility more than doubles. And now it's interesting to see how macroprudential policy, if it can contain these dynamics. And we see in our first simple macroprudential rule of 90% cap for all borrower types, that it brings down the value of debt to income almost to the traditional banking level, but also like we have a cap of 90% and not 80%, so we would expect it to be a bit higher. Interestingly, wealth inequality stays the same, and this is due to the fact that wealth inequality is here more determined by the commercial bank's procyclical loan-to-value rule, because like at low prices, we see in the model that a lot of first-time buyers enter the market, and the higher the leverage is that they can get, the more first-time buyers enter the market, and buy-to-let investors usually try to sell their assets. And the better the access for first-time buyers is to enter the market here, the more portfolio reshuffling you have from high-income rich households to low-income poorer households, who would who lead to a lower concentration of housing in the population. And then you see like an overall lower wealth inequality. But since this, as I can also go back, since you see here, this is the time this happens down here, and the loan-to-value ratios are quite similar in this procyclical model. So we see a very similar wealth inequality dynamics. Okay, let's get to the core of our results, and this is by research the effect of borrower-specific loan-to-value caps by limiting in model D the first-time buyers to 70%, while all the other agents have a loan-to-value cap of 90%. And in model E, we limit the second and subsequent buyers, and in model F, we limit the buy-to-let investors, and we see the results here. So first, for debt to income, we see that the limitation for model D and E, so limiting first-time buyers and second and subsequent buyers, reduces debt to income ratio somewhat, but compared to the reduction of debt to income ratios when limiting buy-to-let investors, this is quite small. So we have the strongest effect on debt to income by limiting buy-to-let investors. And for the wealth inequality, we see that when limiting first-time buyers, we actually increase wealth inequality by almost 1 percentage point. So it's not by much, but it's statistically significant. We don't see like a real change when limiting second and subsequent buyers, but we see a reduction when we limit buy-to-let investors. For consumption volatility, it is similar to the debt to income ratio. Both these measures are closely linked to the housing cycle. So the less debt-fueled a housing cycle is, the lower the house price peaks, and lower house price peaks also mean lower maximum consumption in the model. So the amplitude goes down. And so we see here for buy-to-let investors the lowest consumption amplitude as compared to the other both other versions. Okay, I remember that I have put another graph in here for the debt to income ratios. These are just scatter plots of all the Monte Carlo runs of these simulations, and we see the red line as the mean value always of model C, and we see this green greenish petrol color is here for a limitation of first-time buyers, limitation of second and subsequent buyers, and limitation of buy-to-let investors. And we see quite clearly that the house price index, which is down here, and the debt to income, which is down here, up here, we see that with limiting buy-to-let investors, also the house prices don't go over 1.5, while some of the model C go above 2, and this is indexed to 2011 housing prices. So we see like a major shift for limiting buy-to-let investors. Okay, so as a last step, I want to go a bit into detail, like how does this happen in the model? Like what changes so that these parameters change? And I want to show you this by looking at the transaction patterns, basically the sale patterns. What you see here are 4 bars. This is basically, I divided up the housing cycle into four parts. I divided the upswing into 2 halves. So what you see here are the transactions for the first half of the upswing, here for the second half of the upswing, here for the first half of the downturn, and the second half of the housing price downturn. And red again is sales to buy-to-let investors, blue to second and subsequent buyers, and green to first-time buyers. And the percentage is the number of sales over the total housing stock. So it's basically the housing market turnover. And we can see that most of the market activity is in the first half of the upswing. This is usually at the end of the first half. So around the middle of the upswing, the market clears. There's the most transactions going on. Then house prices get very high, and there are fewer agents able to enter the market, which is why transactions go down. And in the downturn, they recede further because many agents don't want to enter the market when prices are falling. And you can also see that there are that buy-to-let investors mainly buy in the upswing. First-time buyers mainly buy when prices are low. So upswing first half and downturn second half. This is when they are able to enter the market. And second and subsequent buyers are kind of in between. So they buy also at very high prices, but they never cease to buy, basically. So what changes now? Looking at the restriction of first-time buyers, we see that in the first half of the upswing, fewer agents, fewer first-time buyers can enter the market. They are more shifted to the second half of the downturn. Their prices are a bit lower, but especially lower income first-time buyers are unable to enter the market with this restriction. And in the end, the buy-to-let investors benefit, which is why we see an increase in wealth inequality. And we don't see a strong reduction in overall debt because first-time buyers' share in overall debt is very low from the beginning. When we restrict second and subsequent buyers, we don't really see a strong shift. This is because second and subsequent buyers usually, so in the model, they just buy a house when they just sold a house. So they usually have more equity than first-time buyers or buy-to-let investors. So their the desired loan-to-value ratio, or like the loan-to-value ratio that they need to buy a house, or like to satisfy the bid price that they want, is most of the time lower than what the bank is willing to give them. So if you restrict this ratio, it doesn't really affect second and subsequent buyers. And finally, we see that that restricting buy-to-let investors, and you can't really see this in this picture because I just divided it up in 4 parts. But we see that buy-to-let investors shift more to lower prices. They have to buy at lower prices, and they have to provide larger down payments, so they have to save longer, which means that fewer buy-to-let investors can enter the market. And this leads to a reduction of the share of housing stock that they are able to hold. And like in the end, the housing stock is more equally distributed, affecting wealth inequality, lowering wealth inequality. And the buy-to-let investors are quite dependent on high loan-to-value ratios because they have fewer financial assets. So limiting them has a stronger effect than limiting the other agents. Okay, so to reiterate, the findings of this model restricting buy-to-let investors yields the most favorable results, is the most efficient. Restricting first-time buyers does harm when you look at wealth inequality, which you might want to, and restricting second and subsequent buyers has only limited effects. And that's basically it. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to questions, comments, and so on. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruben. Floor is open for questions, so please go ahead, or if you want, raise your hands.
Raise your voice or your hands.
Well, while people are thinking of questions, I can start with a, so you found in the results, in the comparison with the core indicators, what is driving the really high rental yield?
What is driving the high rental?
I was wondering, right? Because it's like twice.
Yeah.
We would expect something around a 5%, right?
Yeah. I'm not really sure. Like the rental market, I'm not really satisfied with it. I think it's like the prices, so that the cyclicality of the rental market is a bit counterintuitive in the model. So it goes up like when house prices go down, and it goes down, but not by much when house prices go up. Also, you have like households don't have like a market sensitive bid price mechanism, because they always bid like a third. So it might be that if my house prices fall to quite low levels, that households don't react by they don't adjust their rental the bid prices on the rental market, that this kind of stabilizes the rental market at quite high prices compared to the housing prices, which would drive yield up. Yeah, but
which links to a second question about the cycles you showed. Am I right to think they're a bit stronger than the original cycles? Are they?
You mean of the original paper?
As compared to the Bank of England working paper.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm thinking mostly probably of the lower end of it, right? Going up to or down to a 0.2 HPI.
Yeah.
What is driving again these stronger cycles? Say in the benchmark case, without the moving
additional.
Exactly. Is that calibration, or is it something with because? Or can it be the consumption function somehow?
This is a good question, because I mean, between me adopting the original working paper and arriving at this model version, there are so many steps and so many changes.
Yeah.
That it's a bit hard for me to pin it down. Like, one thing that could be is definitely that I don't have, as in the original model, they are like deposit endowments. When a household is born, so to say, they get like an endowment equal to their desired deposits.
Yeah, exactly.
And I deactivated this to have to better understand like where where the money is coming from, so to a bit lower the disappearing, the appearing of funds out of, of exogenous origin. And I think that this reduces definitely the deposits of first-time buyers. So what you have is first-time buyers with lower purchasing power. And since first-time buyers enter the market at low prices, this could mean that they have to fall to even lower prices for them to enter the market and then turn the cycle again. So I think this could be this, and combined probably with the consumption function, which is quite, if you are a low income household, you are not able to save a lot, definitely. But I'm not really sure how it connects to the, how it compares to the distribution that you put in the Baptista version. If they are, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be hard to pin down the comparison. I think the consumption mechanism in that Baptista paper is certainly way more rough, simple. I think the improvements you introduced are probably playing some interesting role here. There is a question in the chat by Mark, who has a bad connection, so he asked a question in the chat. Have you used different indicators of inequality? For example, the share of wealth of the 10% with respect to the 20%, or Gini coefficients?
I think I used the Palmer index at some point, but that was at a time where I had like higher debt in the model, and so I got a lot of negative equity at the low end of the distribution when house prices were turning negative, not were turning negative, when were going low. And then I had like ridiculous values for the Palmer index. So no, I haven't really looked at them. I think what would be more, or what would be interesting, would be to compare renters and homeowners, because when I say here wealth inequality decreases, this means not that renters, I mean the share of renters in all wealth or in total wealth decreases actually. So yeah, but I think these indicators should work similarly, but I'm not sure 100%.
So you mean that the indicators you presented are renters taken into account somehow, or?
I mean, sure. This is just a comparison between the top 10%.
Okay, yeah.
What the top 10% have in wealth.
Yes.
But yeah, renters are always at the bottom, basically.
Yeah.
Thanks.